everyone, and welcome back to Mongabay's webinar series for journalists. I am Mike DiGirolamo. I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's discussion, and I am broadcasting to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. So this webinar is viewable on both YouTube and also on LinkedIn. And it will remain on YouTube in perpetuity after this broadcast, but you can leave comments during on both LinkedIn and YouTube. So we ask that you please subscribe to Mongabay's YouTube channel so that you can be notified when our next webinar is announced, but you can also get notifications about our webinar series by subscribing to Mongabay's webinar newsletter. And you can find that by using the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner of the landing page at mongabay.com. So today's webinar topic is how to cover the European Union Deforestation Regulation, otherwise known as the EUDR. So implementation of the EUDR is going to be approaching quite soon. It's a landmark law that's going to have global implications for forest protection and various commodities. And in this webinar, we're going to look at what journalists really need to understand about the law's real-world impact, including what's going to happen next with the legislation, the complicating factors that could undermine its effectiveness, and how traceability will be enforced. So just as a reminder, Mongabay is always seeking your pitches. So if you think of like a story idea you have after viewing today's discussion, go to mongabay.org, click on opportunities, and then on pitch Mongabay a story and follow the instructions from there. But if you don't pitch a story idea to us, we always encourage you to pitch to other outlets as well. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panel, starting with Karla Mendes. Karla is an award-winning Brazilian journalist and features writer here at Mongabay, specializing in environmental land and property rights issues. Before Mongabay, she worked as a land and property rights correspondent for the Thomson Reuters Foundation and as a business reporter for over 10 years. And also joining us is Fyfe Strachan. Fyfe is the policy and communications lead at Earthsight, which is a London-based nonprofit with award-winning investigations into illegal timber and commodity supply chains. She advocates for governments in the European Union and beyond to implement strong regulations tackling their role their consumption plays in driving deforestation and human rights abuses around the globe. And then also joining us is Leah Samberg. Leah works as the lead scientist for the Accountability Framework Initiative, a program of the Rainforest Alliance. She heads the AFI's work to develop and align practical metrics for responsible supply chains and to embed these metrics broadly through different monitoring and accountability systems. And she also leads the AFI's work on land sector carbon emissions and engagements with carbon and climate initiatives. So just to recap, we're going to give each panelist an opportunity to address each of the questions that we have planned, and then we're going to hold about a 15-minute Q&A at the end of this webinar for your questions as our time allows. So if you do think of a question you want to ask our panel, go ahead and drop it in the chat on whichever platform you're tuning in on, whether it's LinkedIn or on YouTube. Just drop it in and I will save it and address it later. You don't have to wait till the end. You will be able to view this webinar on demand on our YouTube channel within about 48 hours of this broadcast. I will also include timestamps and any resources that our panelists will share today. If you registered for this webinar, you'll receive a publication notice directly to your email, and we'll also publish a link to this webinar on our blog at mongabay.org. All right, that's everything. Let's go ahead and get started with our first question. So panel, can you please briefly explain what is the EUDR, why and how it arose and what it seeks to do, and how significant it could be in reducing deforestation? Anyone is welcome to chime in.
I'm happy to jump in. So effectively, the EUDR is a Europe-wide law that regulates the trade in certain commodities in order to ensure that products sold in Europe are legally produced and that they don't cause deforestation. So a key driver of this law is the recognition of the fact that around 90% of tropical deforestation is caused by agricultural consumption, and the majority of this is due to just a handful of commodities. So the EUDR aims to regulate European consumption in forest risk commodities in order to address Europe's deforestation impact. The law applies to 7 commodities, so that's timber, soy, palm oil, cocoa, coffee, rubber and cattle includes both beef and leather. And these commodities were selected based on an impact assessment that basically showed that these are the areas where European consumption is having the greatest impact on deforestation. And a really key part of the law is the fact that it requires companies to do due diligence. So companies need to do due diligence to show that the goods that they're bringing in to Europe haven't caused deforestation post 2020 and have been produced legally. So overall, this is a law that really has the capacity to be hugely significant. Around 16% of the deforestation caused by international trade is due to European consumption. So just addressing that part of global deforestation through this regulation of consumption could on its own be really significant in terms of its deforestation impact. And there's also really significant potential carbon and climate change impacts as well. So an EU analysis of possible impacts before the law was produced found that it could save around 49 megatons of CO2 emissions per year, which is around the equivalent of taking 18 million cars off the road. So the potential impacts of the law could be really huge.
Thank you very much, Fyfe.
I can jump in on that incredibly well specified explanation of the law for be a little bit of broader background, which is where we're coming from a lot from the Accountability Framework Initiative side, which is that the EUDR is situated in this much broader landscape of deforestation-free supply chain work that's been ongoing for quite some time now, with both civil society and leading companies working for more than a decade to build this business case for de-free supply chains. It's largely so far been in the voluntary space where you have the New York Declaration on Forests in 2017, which you saw many of these largest companies committing to de-free supply chains. The Accountability Framework Initiative has supported hundreds of companies in setting and implementing commitments to halt deforestation, as well as conversion of other ecosystems and associated human rights abuses. And while so far this has been largely in the voluntary space, the theory of change for this work has almost always included eventual regulatory pressure that sort of everyone knew was going to be needed to reinforce and complement that voluntary action. So the EUDR is exactly such a development, and it's been welcomed by all the folks who've been working on this for a long time. But I think it's important to think about the fact that also a primary role of this legislation is going to be always to sort of bring up the floor of sort of the deforestation and commodity trade, pressuring some of the lagging companies who haven't been part of this voluntary effort to catch up with the leaders. And to that end, we're already seeing the UDR be really effective at getting deforestation on the radar and agendas of a lot of these companies that had never paid it much attention before. So, I think looking at this law is one piece of a much bigger effort to incentivize all of these different types of companies to address deforestation. And so it's certainly not sufficient to have any of these impacts, but it's definitely a necessary part of it.
I can also chime in, especially from the reporting angle, that the UDR regulation is aimed to also address this imbalance of deforestation that usually is driven by the global north, but importing commodities from the global south, where most of our tropical forests are. And as a journalist, you know that there have been several investigations revealing how, beef, coffee from the global south arrive and is sold at, supermarkets, grocery stores in Europe and elsewhere. And so this also brings the accountability component, because the buyers cannot say that, oh, we didn't know that this product was linked to deforestation. So it's really important to set accountability from who is buying, because if deforestation is happening in the global south and the products are being bought in the global north, everyone must be accountable for that. So it's really important to, to end impunity and especially in address environmental crimes and human rights violations, especially against traditional communities.
Thank you, everyone, for that very informative, concise introduction. So it is said that companies have the primary responsibility for compliance. So what legal teeth does this legislation have to enforce that compliance? And what might be the repercussions for failing to abide by it? And what questions should journalists be asking to help strengthen this transparency and accountability?
Well, I can chime in again, based on the reporting I did specifically on two industries, the pulp industry, the soy industry, that the experts I spoke with, they told that the companies must see the EUDR, as part of the business. So if they're aiming to export their products to the Europe, they must comply with the EUDR regulation and have that, in their risk assessment while they're selling their products. And as journalists, it's really important to understand all the process. To be honest, there is a lot of information. It's very specific. There is a lot of details, but it's really important to understand both sides, what the regulation is, what's requiring the companies to do, and also to understand the company side, what they're doing. Because, as Mike said, I was a business reporter. So as I covered this, I really brought that knowledge when I covered the companies. And so it's really important to understand the other side, what they're doing. And also, if they promise stating they're doing something, they're not, you can even, follow up on this and write a story on that.
Yeah, I would build on what Karla was saying there about accountability for companies. I think that's a really important part of the law, and I think the EUDR has several teeth, I guess, several ways that it is kind of enforceable and that companies are held to account. And one really key one that's good for journalists to sort of keep in mind is that there's a kind of national regulatory mechanism around this. So there'll be a competent authority in every country, and most countries in Europe have appointed one now, and that competent authority will be required to check a proportion of operators, so a proportion of businesses that are importing or selling EUDR covered goods every year. So there's going to be mandatory checks regulated by the law, and then they have the power to levy some pretty hefty fines, up to 4% of global annual turnover. So that sort of provides some kind of regulatory teeth. They have some powers also to stop and inspect shipments, for example. So they've got various mechanisms they can use to enforce the law. And so I think for journalists to be aware of when thinking about enforceability of the EUDR and the teeth that this law has, one of the questions that will be really interesting to ask once the law is implemented is, how are competent authorities using those powers? Because some things are mandatory and some things will be at the discretion of authorities. So they'll be bringing out an annual report each year, or the law requires every competent authority to bring out an annual report. And this happens right now under the EU timber regulation, which is the precursor to the EUDR. And what we've seen reading those reports is there is a really wide variance between enforcement of the EUDR, with some countries not doing many checks, not levying many fines or doing many enforcement actions, and then other countries doing quite a lot. So monitoring those reports is a really key way that journalists can kind of help to hold hold companies to account for compliance and to hold governments to account. But the other key point that Earthsight has pointed out before as well is that the way that the law is set up, there could be a tendency for competent authorities, when the law is in place, to try and meet their quota by checking a lot of small companies who are likely in many cases not to either not have a due diligence system or to be falling short in some way of compliance due to ignorance. And that would be an easy way for competent authorities to hit their quotas, but it would not be nearly as impactful on deforestation as if they focus their energies on the largest importers who are responsible for the greatest volumes of deforestation-linked commodities coming into Europe. So we think it would be much more impactful for competent authorities to be focusing their energies on the big players and to be looking deeply and to be doing some really meaningful enforcement actions. But it's a really important role of media to sort of hold them to account for that once implementation starts.
That is a great segue to the one additional thing I was going to add to both of those great answers, which is, yes, I absolutely agree with what you just said, that I think a lot of the questions and discretion and variability around enforcement is going to have the largest effect on smaller companies who may be struggling a little more to understand their supply chains, maybe a little later to the game, maybe um, figuring out how to demonstrate compliance is going to be something that they still are kind of coming up to capacity on. And there's a lot of, I think we'll all sort of see how these various enforcement mechanisms are treating those companies. However, for the large companies, which I agree, should continue to be the focus of where we're looking here, I think that the question is less about, can a company succeed in shipping compliant materials to the EU and check the boxes to comply, and more about how they're complying. Are they actually working to reduce deforestation, or are they bifurcating supply chains and having a very streamlined mechanism where they're sending, their clean stuff to Europe and everything that is associated with deforestation elsewhere? So I think that looking at these larger companies, not just are they meeting the compliance checks, but how are they doing that? What mechanisms are they using to provide compliant materials? I think is where a lot of for me, the bigger questions are, as opposed to just are they meeting these compliance checks.
Those were great points raised by you all. Thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to move on to our next question. Also has to do with compliance. A coffee supply chain sustainability advocate told Mongabay that coffee is among the easiest for compliance to be achieved. So, of the commodities listed in the EUDR, what are the key challenges for compliance, and how could companies circumnavigate those? What are some ideas for some solutions-oriented stories that journalists could write about this topic?
I'm happy to start here since I just realized I hadn't remuted myself. So I have to keep going. So yeah, compliance is, the challenges are definitely going to differ based on the nature of the supply chain. And a primary challenge of that is, of course, sort of this idea of supply chain segregation, which another way to say it is, how commodified is your commodity? And in many cases, you have higher value products like coffee and cocoa that can basically be decommodified with, the price supporting specialized supply chains, trading in products with known attributes such as deforestation-free, and certification systems like Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, et cetera, are already using those mechanisms to basically decommodify these commodities. Um, and operators who are using those certifications can capitalize on that. But also, I think it already helps to build some of that infrastructure in supply chains that can support supply chains that aren't certified, but can build on some of that same infrastructure. So I think some of those potentially higher value products have a real lot of potential there. I think similarly with certification, robust certification is so widespread in the timber industry that there's a lot of um, infrastructure there to build on to separate out, have this infrastructure that's already separating out compliant from non-compliant material. Um, but then you have something like soy that's always going to be a true commodity. No one's paying more for forest-friendly soybeans. It's all getting dumped into a big boat, and keeping this soy separate from that soy is not really feasible, or would be really expensive in a lot of cases. So see that be true for palm oil and a lot of these other products. So I think for me, a solution-oriented question, sort of story that I'm really interested in all across all these commodities is, how do we start thinking about addressing both deforestation and compliance with the EUDR at a broader scale? I think that I'm hearing a lot of people really talking about how do we look at efforts to manage compliance at the level of the sourcing area, whether that's a landscape, like a cooperative, a supply shed of a mill, by working cooperatively with other buyers to sort of address deforestation across these shared supply bases. And I think that for a lot of these supply chains where there's these traceability challenges, that's like a really promising way forward that can actually also have an impact on the ground. So I think that is a direction that is really has a lot of space to expand.
Yeah, I agree that the challenge depend on the industry. I can provide some insights specifically about the pulp industry and the soy and vegetable oil industry that I did stories on it. And like one of the main things that they set as challenges were one, to really have to provide a lot of documentation. So some companies said they need to invest in blockchain to have all the documents they have to submit to prove that their products are compliant. And that could, like in case of pulp, could increase the price per ton by $230, for example. At the same time, the other industries in both pulp and soy, they mentioned that challenges to really have the information of each farm on each plot of land to prove the origin of that. In the case of soy, it's even more more complicated because they say that they usually use shared silos, or ships to export this product, and these are not likely to be accepted anymore, like this pool of companies. And aligns with it was said before that the small companies are more likely to be affected by that. But at the same time, we see that the big companies also, like there was a dry run that I covered in detail from the stories, that for a big company, we can share the link with you all, and like they analyze point by point of everything, then show that even the big companies, while they could comply with several requirements, they failed in many details as well. But this doesn't mean that the EUDR shouldn't be enforced. As we see the destruction of our forests and impact on climate change, it's an urgent issue, and the companies could be done this way before, shouldn't have this enforcement before producing in a sustainable way. And for solution-oriented stories, it would be good to look at well-succeeded cases of sustainable projects, focus on the commodities that are cited in the legislation. Most of times they are smaller projects, but really think how they could be reproduced and gain scale to be implemented for the big industry. Because we see that for several examples that it's possible to do it.
I don't have much to add to those two fantastic answers. And I think that, the key points have really been made, that there's obviously some real compliance challenges from different industries. But I think we often see, I have a colleague at Earthsight who has been monitoring positive stories on the EUDR every week, just to sort of, so we can be keeping track of what's going well and not always not always so focused on the negative stories that are quite easy to focus on. And we see, positive stories coming out every week across every commodity, and often commodities that there are some commodities with very well-known, well-documented traceability challenges. Cattle comes to mind as an example, because cattle move around from farm to slaughterhouse from farm to feeding to slaughterhouse, and that can pose real traceability challenges. But then Uruguay has a national traceability program and has had it for nearly 20 years. So I think often there's challenges that we see, but we also see these examples of either national initiatives or company initiatives or producer cooperative initiatives to get over some of those challenges. And that in many ways is one of the really exciting things that the EUDR is already delivering before it's in force, is a lot of these positive initiatives to overcome these long-standing challenges of supply chain traceability and visibility. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. And not to complicate the situation further, but a report from Profundo, which is a Dutch NGO, found that compliance costs with the EUDR would be minimal or negligible to various industries. However, lots of industry lobbyists or advocates disagree with that assessment. So, to your knowledge, would the cost to industry be minimal or negligible?
I'm happy to jump in on the Profundo report if that's helpful. Having read the report, but not being an economist with that caveat, but having looked at the findings in the Profundo report, just to give a little more detail, it estimated that EUDR compliance costs would be just 0.1% of company revenues on average. And that was based on having a look at 12 companies of different sizes and calculating the costs for both setting up and implementing the due diligence systems they'd need for EUDR. And another key finding from there was that if they were to pass costs on to consumers, the price increases would be tiny. So they gave an example of chocolate prices would increase by 0.007%, and other sorts of, they gave a number of other examples. And one of the reasons for that is that some of the products we buy only have a fraction of the EUDR covered commodity. For example, soy milk is mostly water. So, I mean, Profundo's report was based on estimates. They were using data that's publicly available because it can be difficult to get confidential company financial data. They looked at, to estimate the costs of setting up and implementing due diligence, they drew on surveys around the costs of implementing similar mechanisms. They looked at costings published by NGOs, cost estimates from businesses that provide due diligence services. So that's sort of what went into it, and it's publicly available, and they've sort of got all their working available for those that want to see a little bit more of how they came up with their costings. And so I've also seen the industry critiques that this is a wild underestimate of the costs of implementing the EUDR. And obviously it's a single report, it's a single set of costings on the basis of 12 kind of model costings. So it's not covering absolutely every eventuality, but I have to say I didn't see many of those industry critiques coming with their own 40-page costings with significant detail. And I think that's an important part of questioning the costings, to have a look at that. So I guess I would say I think that the Profundo report, while there may be quibbles with a costing here or a costing there, I think the key point that it's making stands and is really important, that the costs of complying with the EUDR are proportional to the benefit that it will deliver, and are manageable.
And build on to that. Yeah, I absolutely agree with the findings of that report, as you were describing. But I think, and where I maybe understand a little bit of pushback against it is that that report largely focuses on, the costs of compliance with the law in terms of, okay, what is the geolocation, the due diligence that you need to do, the modern notification you need to do to make, to provide, okay, I can feel confident that this is a D-free product. What it doesn't take largely into account is the cost of actually building and maintaining a deforestation-free supply chain. So I think trying to separate out those two pieces is important. And I guess need to build on what I was saying previously a little bit. I think a real question is, when you're talking about the cost of actually, producing, import, providing, purchasing EUDR compliant material, are you asking about the cost to manage a deforestation-free supply chain that actually incentivizes decreased forest clearance? Or are you talking about a cost to put in place infrastructure that allows you to sell compliant material to the EU and non-compliant material to China? Both of those things cost money, and probably more money than, is indicated in the Profundo report. But for the first one, if you're a company that is serious about saying, okay, I'm going to meet my climate targets, my emissions reduction targets, my net zero targets, my nature targets, then the additionality of EUD compliance is probably not much. All of those costs to build this responsible supply chain are sort of already accounted for. And so EUDR compliance is sort of baked into that, except for that little bit identified by Profundo of actually doing the sort of compliance due diligence work. At the second piece, which is, okay, companies are saying, okay, this is going to be expenses because I'm going to have to do this total bifurcation of my supply chain, have all these additional ships to send, good material here, bad material there. Then, I think that there's a lot of potential investments happening there, but they're not the investments that we want them to be making. So I think really looking at, all right, these companies that say that this is going to be really expensive for them, what are they actually spending that money on? Is it the building the supply chain that we want to see them building, or is it the infrastructure to create that sort of two-tiered market?
fantastic insights. Karla?
Yeah, no, just to add that I talked a little bit about the cost in my previous remarks, but like at the same time that there could be a cost associated that for some sectors they could say it could be high. At the same time, the question is during how long these companies have been earning profits at the cost of deforestation in our planet. And at the same time, experts say that there's really an opportunity for them to enforce and set up a deforestation-free supply chain. And this, in the medium long term, will add value to their products. And then instead of just be selling this product to the EUDR, they can have like a more premium product to be selling to other markets. And with that, they can balance and make more money with that because they can prove that their products are deforestation free against with other companies who are not doing that.
Thank you, everyone. That was incredibly informative. While the EUDR is pretty focused on reducing deforestation, it also integrates certain human rights protections. So, panel, what are the main human rights considerations that are included in the legislation? And also, what are some of the gaps that still exist? And what are key questions or nuances about human rights that journalists should look into in the EUDR?
I can chime in again. That's the main focus of my coverage is especially on this human rights violations. And so one of the great things about the EUDR is that it does not accept products that come from indigenous territory, regardless of the stage of their demarcation. And this is a big clash with a lot of sectors who said that they don't sell products that derive for indigenous territories that are fully demarcated. Just for background, in Brazil, the process of demarcation of indigenous territories can last decades. And then they have several stages, sometimes fully demarcated, at some states not. And there are even some inconsistencies within Brazil and lawsuits going on regarding this. But the great thing is that the EUDR is clear that it follows the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. So that's really a path, a really good step to ensure the land rights for traditional communities. And another thing is regarding to is modern slavery labor. That's an issue that's also very common to be reported in many commodity supply chains. And EUDR really brings a lot of requirements that the companies have to comply with. And at the same time, it opens opportunity for us as journalists to really cross-check and report on that, because the company says that, okay, I'm not, breaking any of these requirements through the information of your geolocation of their farms. You can use programs like QGIS, that's awesome, to do geospatial analysis and see if deforestation happened in that plot of land previous to the cutoff date of December 2024. And at the same time, there are databases of modern slavery issues in Brazil, for example. And so it really advances a lot to ensure these rights, because usually what we see is the most vulnerable communities are the most affected by environmental crimes and climate change. So the EUDR sets important precedent to protect those communities, who usually are the most guardians of the forest.
Thank you very much, Karla.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add to what Karla was saying. I think, as Karla's just been explaining, it's the legality component of the EUDR, the legality requirement is one of the most important parts of the law. So it doesn't just have a requirement that you can't bring in goods from post-2020 deforestation, but goods have to be produced in accordance with relevant laws in the production country. And as Karla has alluded, that there's a list of which relevant laws, which laws would be considered relevant legislation. And this includes laws covering land use rights, environmental protection, labor rights, the principle of free, prior and informed consent, and other human rights protected under international law insofar as they relate to the area of production. So that's quite a significant human rights protection in the law. And significantly, there's no cutoff for this legality requirement. So the deforestation requirement is for land. You can't bring in goods associated with land deforested after 2020. That post 2020 cutoff isn't there for legality. And so what that means is it could cover potentially illegal activity like land grabbing or Indigenous rights violations that occurred before 2020, which means that EUDR could be a really significant tool for addressing some of those human rights issues that have historically come with the production of export commodities like FPIC violations and land grabbing. But of course, in order for that to be the case, it is very important that businesses and competent authorities as well really take that legality requirement seriously and really look at the true, I guess, the spirit of legality, or what it actually means. So not looking at, when doing due diligence on products, not just looking at, does this come with a government certificate or does it come with a piece of paper or can I tick a box? I think similar to the points that Leah was making before, looking at genuinely, has there been human rights violations in the production of this commodity, and asking those questions. Is there evidence of FPIC violations in the acquisition of the land associated with this commodity? Are there corruption allegations? Have there been adverse court findings for bribery? Were the goods produced on land that's actually meant to be part of a protected area? So I think these kinds of issues, which we've seen in commodity supply chains for a long time, the EUDR has the capacity to address those if it's well implemented and well enforced.
I don't have that much to add to those answers, but maybe just one more piece building on what Fyfe was just saying, which is that, a big distinction between the sort of deforestation-free supply chain work that we generally do with companies and the EUDR is that, the EUDR applies specifically to, a product, like a ton of this material, a soybean, a coffee bean, a cocoa bean, and the land that it was produced on, where, and so what a company is doing on other land or in other parts of its business aren't covered by this law. So I think thinking, as you're stepping back and looking at what's happening with these, I think looking at sort of compliance of those materials brought into the EU is certainly important, and that's how the law works. But I think part of looking into how well this is working is saying, is this law at all pressuring companies to improve their performance across their whole business? Human rights abuses are systemic. People often find. So I think saying, this company is doing business in all these different places. Are these, if these particular materials are passing these compliance checks, but are there human rights violations going on elsewhere in their business that we should be aware of that are sort of being hidden in this EUDR process? So I think, as with deforestation, but potentially even more with human rights, seeing what the company's doing across its business is a really important part of assessing whether they're sort of, abiding by the spirit of EUDR and not just the letter of the law.
Just would like to chime in and complement that. Although the EUDR would be covered specifically that as one area, but especially thinking about reporting, if you're covering those specific areas that are being banned from EUDR and all the human rights violations, land grabbing, and anything related to it, it could lead to really strong impacts. And I'm saying this because as we were listening to them, I remember I covered the palm oil industry for many years from Mongabay, and there is greenwashing, as everyone know, it happens, the company says it's sustainable, and then we see what's behind that. There is violence, land grabbing, and in a specific case I covered in Pará State, for example, I found that they were land grabbing in a palm oil company that had an RSPO certificate, that the land was overlapping cemeteries claimed by indigenous and Quilombola communities and all that. And after the investigation, their RSPO suspended the certificate. So it's really important for us to look at every case is important for reporting, and this could help drive changes, because if a company lose or had the certificate suspended, it has an impact because it can be banned for exporting from several other places beyond the UDR too.
Thank you very much, everyone. Just a note for our audience, a term that we've used several times in this webinar is FPIC. That stands for Free, Prior, and Informed Consent. Terms like this will be also listed in the show notes, so please do check that if you have questions. Our next question is going back to a point we raised about smallholder farmers earlier. So this law, the EUDR, prohibits the mixing of commodities, for example, compliant, non-compliant, or commodities of unknown origin across the entire supply chain, otherwise barring their entry to the EU. So there are arguments that this is a very difficult task for smallholders. So what solutions are available, and who should be providing that support?
I can start with maybe a sort of bigger picture answer, which again goes back to the fact that yes, a lot of these commodities are produced in large part by smallholders. Coffee, cocoa, palm, rubber. There's a lot of smallholder production, and for companies that again are sort of doing the work to build deforestation-free supply chains across all of their business, that involves a lot of work with supporting those smallholders to be able to achieve compliance not just with the EUDR, but with sort of a broader suite of deforestation-free, conversion-free supply chain requirements. So that can look like working with smallholder groups. It can look like working with local governments to provide information, capacity building support, both to be aware of what these regulations are, what they say, what the voluntary commitments of companies that are buying from these areas say. So there's a huge sort of information and awareness piece of that. There's capacity building, and that is on everything from again the actual building a deforestation-free supply chain piece, which might be improving yields on a farm so a smallholder doesn't have to expand, for example, to the actual EUDR compliance piece, which might be doing the walking around with the GPS and getting the geolocation data. So what are the places where the downstream companies have, in order to meet both their own commitments and regulatory compliance, are needing to provide support to these smallholders to both support their livelihoods and to improve production, support improved production in these regions, and really sort of a transformation um, of that ecosystem. So I think that again, something I'll probably keep saying is that if these companies are working to sort of meet no deforestation targets already, meet climate targets, meet nature targets, most of this work is already part of that. And the additionality of EUDR is okay, let's do the geolocation, things like that. So certainly working with smallholders is going to be a piece of the puzzle of solving, a lot of our largest agricultural challenges. One other thing that I'll note, and this is sort of getting beyond sort of the stuff that I know that well, but what I've heard is that a lot of companies that have very sort of smallholder heavy supply bases feel pretty confident about meeting EUDR requirements, and that a lot of the sort of largest pushback and sort of delays coming from companies that don't have that smallholder base. So, I think that, and some of those companies might be sort of using smallholder exclusion as an excuse to, advocate for further delays, et cetera. So I do think that from what I hear, there's a little bit of obfuscation going on there as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. I think that's a great answer. I think, in just building on what Leah just said, in some of our Earthsight research, we've had a look into who's responsible for sort of bringing the commodities into Europe, and found in the case of quite a number of EUDR covered commodity supply chains are really dominated by the top 10 largest importers. For example, it's something like 80% of palm oil from Indonesia comes in through the top 10 largest importers. So I think when we're looking at smallholders in EUDR supply chains, yeah, it's very important. An important role for journalists is looking at what are some of these larger companies that are responsible for the lion's share of EUDR covered imports doing to support smallholders in their supply chains to get, provide the information that they need for EUDR compliance. And as Leah has said, as part of a larger program that they should be implementing around working with smallholders in a productive way. And we'd hope to see that some of this might provide an opportunity, that the kinds of traceability systems, for example, that might be the information sharing that might be required for EUDR could potentially provide opportunities for other kinds of information sharing that might assist and benefit smallholders in their work with larger companies that are importing into Europe.
Great answer. Just wanted to add that there are several NGOs who carry out really great projects with indigenous communities, quilombola communities, to help them protect their land and report claims of deforestation, environmental crimes using like a mobile phone. So like providing geolocation nowadays is not that complicated, because with a mobile phone, we can do it. So I think that one alternative is having the companies teaming up with grassroots project institutions and NGOs who have experience doing this tracking land use in protected areas. They could think about a solution to have and adapt it in a way that could allow smallholders to do their role in the supply chain, and then they wouldn't be excluded from the production because of EUDR. And also like because they have an instrument called declaration in excess, that when the companies can't really provide that every batch comes from a specific farm, they can use that instrument, and then where they list the batch of and name all the farms and ensuring that it's compliant with the EUDR. So this could allow, along with some specific projects, to implement the deforestation-free requirements in the entire supply chain.
Thank you, everyone. That was very, very good answers there. So outdated forest data could create a loophole for commodities from areas deforested after the law's cutoff date. So how can these data gaps be addressed in a transparent way? And how does the European Union support producers to close those information gaps and ensure the data is reliable?
I'm not happy to jump in first here, although there's potentially a clarifying question, which is sort of, I'm curious if there's something specific that is being referred to here in terms of outdated forest data. And I ask because honestly, forest data is really good and we have a lot of it. In the vast majority of cases, determining whether land has been cleared for agriculture since 2020 is fairly easy to do. A lot of companies are successfully monitoring deforestation across really complex supply chains around the world. There's traceability challenges, certainly. But as far as, once you have a polygon, once you have a square on a map, knowing whether or not it's been cleared since 2020 is something that we can do quite well in most cases. There's definitely tricky cases, including transitions from natural forest to tree plantations. There's things like that the data are quickly getting better. And I suspect that EUDR has spurred acceleration of those data tools to fill those gaps, which is great. But outside of some of those sort of marginal cases, the data are very good. And I think that I'm always a little bit suspect when I hear sort of oh, the data aren't good enough yet, because the data, the forest land cover data are really the limiting factor. So I think building credibility and confidence in the huge amount of data we have is actually an important step at this point. So my thoughts, but I'm interested if there's something specific that's being referred to in this question.
I can chime in. It might have come from a story that I did where one of the industry groups said that there is a kind of a problem with the delay of the official deforestation data from Brazil, from the National Space Research Institute, now as EB, because although they release the alerts on a much faster basis, the annual deforestation data, sometimes depending on the time they're analyzing for that shipment, can be 1 year outdated. So it was one of the claims they had. And the other one was also about the size of the resolution of the area and the resolution of the image that EUDR is requiring, and does not comply with what's available from INPE. But as I talk to experts and looking at the EUDR as well, so like what the law legislation says is that it's okay, you have the annual data, but then they should use beyond the annual data any other database that are available. Like they have the PRODIS, that's, the alerts, they have Global Forest Watch, they have many databases, as you said, that are available. So it's not an excuse for not complying with it, even though I know that the agriculture industry has been pressuring the Brazilian government a lot to make some changes on this requirement. So because they kind of want to have a kind of a backup from the Brazilian government. They're doing well.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes, I mean, I think a couple of things. One, certainly there is going to be a sort of a year time lag for this. It's, if we're saying, okay, is the soy that, or the palm oil, or the anything that we bought this year associated with deforestation, brand new deforestation 6 months ago, it's certainly possible that there's a time lag there, but I think that is not a data problem. It's a how fast can people look at numbers problem. But I think that once the system is moving, that sort of lag gets built into it. I think there is there are many stories to write about. Brazil has the best data in the world on this stuff. They have there's a huge amount of data from the government and from local sort of multi-stakeholder networks, civil society, academic networks that produce data. There's a huge amount of scrutiny also from elsewhere on Brazilian land cover data. So there's sort of a embarrassment of riches when it comes to forest data in Brazil. And I think the question, as you put it out there, is much more about sort of contestation between those different sources of authority, as opposed to sort of poor data or absence of data.
Fyfe, did you have anything to add? No?
No, I don't think so. Thanks.
Okay. So the EUDR has been delayed by 12 months and is scheduled to go into effect on December 30th, 2025. So panel, why exactly has this legislation been delayed, and what should journalists be highlighting for readers?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. So yes, the law was delayed. It was originally supposed to come into force at the end of 2024, but in October 2024, the EU Commission announced they were going to push back the start date to the 30th of December 2025, so the end of this year. And when they did that, the Commission cited conversations they'd had with global partners, and particularly at the UN General Assembly, which happened in September 2024. They said they were providing an extra 12 months delay to support operators to implement the law more smoothly from the start. I think there are two other factors that probably fed into that delay, one of which is that the European Commission was quite late in releasing some guidance material that came with the law. So that official guidance material actually came out in October at the same time as the delay announcement. But another factor, and possibly the key factor in the reason for the delay, is that it was precipitated by a period of absolutely feverish lobbying from companies affected by the law and their trade associations. As Earthsight pointed out at the time, some of the groups that were lobbying against the law had themselves been implicated in cases of illegal deforestation, or may well have had compliance issues rather than just compliance issues from a sort of legality or deforestation perspective. And there was also a push to delay the law from within the EU Council itself. So that's the representative of the national governments, led by the Austrian agriculture minister, building on arguments that had been used by the country's forestry and farming lobbies. So I think in terms of thinking about what journalists should highlight, perhaps less important to think about what journalists should highlight in terms of the delay in 2024, and more important to think about the calls for delay that we're starting to hear now that we've hit the same time a year later, so September 2025. I think in the last year, we've seen almost constant attacks on the law since it was delayed. And we've seen fresh calls for delay coming from businesses in the last few months as the implementation deadline draws near again. So I think it's really important for journalists to look behind these calls for delay. I think the calls always come with arguments that it's about traceability, it's about red tape, it's about the difficulty of setting up these systems. And that may be a genuine concern for some, but I think it's important for the media to be looking behind that and asking, is the group calling for this delay primarily attempting to avoid addressing deforestation in their supply chains? Perhaps have they been found to have deforestation or illegal activity or human rights abuses in their supply chains before? And it's also, I think, really important to look at the bigger picture when we're talking about delays. So right now in September 2025, companies could be arguing they only have 2.5 months to implement the law. But in reality, they've had since the middle of 2023 when the law came into force, or since 2020, 2021 when the law was being debated and clearly the writing was on the law. Or in other cases, companies were making voluntary commitments to act on deforestation years before then. So if they're not ready now, it's probably worth asking whether some of those calls for delay are excuses for continued inaction.
Well said. In all cases, yeah. So I think that's true. I think certainly, like, companies push back against regulation is not a surprise, and you know there should be a look at all of the usual reasons that that's happening, and sort of the motivations behind it. I think a couple of important things to think about, though, and one is that the cutoff date of 2020 isn't changing, hopefully, as far as we know. So deforestation happening in 2023, 2024, this year, is still going to be non-compliant with the EUDR regardless of when that effect date starts. So in theory, at least, this delay doesn't actually greenlight any new deforestation. Deforestation happening now is already non-compliant. It has been for several years now. So I think that's an important piece of it. So, what is this delay doing? I think there's three main things. First of all, like, it does give good actors, small companies, et cetera, time to get their ducks in a row to demonstrate compliance, which everyone agrees it's like a lot of work and it's hard. So do the geolocation, work with their smallholders, understand, the risky parts of their supply chain, try to mitigate that risk. Like, on the upside, like, it buys more time for good actors to act good and be ready. And second, it gives bad actors more time to get ready to further bifurcate their supply chains, as I said, making it easier for them to send their compliant materials to the EU, non-compliant stuff elsewhere without changing their business as usual at all. So I think this is like the place to look, is what are the systems being put in place right now, capitalizing on that delay for companies to avoid actually having to address deforestation. So I think, for me, that's really the question. And I mean, relatedly, there are a lot of these larger companies that are very well able to be compliant with EUDR right now across 80-90% of their supply chain. But because, they want to keep on keeping deforestation and the other 20 or 10 or 20% of their supply chain, it's in their best interest to have the message that addressing deforestation is hard. So even if they can be EUDR compliant, they're still going to push back against this because, the more it looks like everyone's saying, oh, this can't be done, the better it is for them regardless. So I think, that point number two here is the place where, like, the digging needs to happen. Point number three is again sort of pulling back out again, which is the farther in time that all of this pushes out, the further this legislation becomes solidified as more of a lagging rather than a leading indicator of company action. For any company that's really intending to meet net zero goals, emissions reduction goals, SBTR target, has a science-based target for nature. These big sources of deforestation should already be addressed this year, next year, the year after. So EUDR compliance becomes really more of a secondary benefit of already having done this hard work of addressing deforestation risk through supply chains. The farther out this goes, it really becomes more of a, maybe a floor for the laggards and less of a driver.
Great points. Just would like to add that last year, despite the criticism of the postponement, some experts weighed in and say, okay, the EU made some changes and I don't know, 2 months before the implementation, and then could be like, acceptable in brackets to, to postpone it to 2025. But now there is no excuse for that anymore. And it's really important to cover who is lobbying for this postponement. I said here by my colleagues before, it's usually it comes from the big industries, and then look who this company, what these companies are, were they involved in deforestation before. There are ongoing lawsuits against them because it's all about money after all.
And on that note, we're going to pull on that thread. So as has been mentioned, there's been intense reports of lobbying efforts against the EUDR. So which countries, groups, corporations, or individuals are currently pushing back the hardest against the EUDR? And you've already mentioned a few of them, but what are some additional lines of inquiry that reporters should be pursuing to uncover hidden agendas and interests?
I can chime in again. Brazil is a key player on this discussion, and I've covered here really a clash within the federal government. While environmental agencies say UDR must be enforced immediately, they are already late, you see the agribusiness department lobbying to postpone it. So Brazil, it's like in Brazil has a particular situation because at the National Congress, we have the most conservative National Congress ever in many years. And anything related to the environment, land demarcation and all that, it remains stuck because they have the majority. And this reflects with pressure over the government. And as Brazil is a huge exporter of commodities, you see how this game and all the sources are being played.
I can jump in on some of the other lobbying that's coming from within Europe. So there's been quite a number of industry-led attacks on the law in recent months. And without attempting an exhaustive list, some groups, we've seen forestry sectors, particularly in Germany and Austria, calling for a special loophole that would exempt them from most due diligence. We've seen the European tanning industry calling for leather to be taken out of the EUDR entirely. We've also seen calls from some parts of the pulp and paper sector calling for an exemption from the law. We've seen big trade federations in Europe for soy, palm oil, leather and wood come together to call for the law to be reopened and generally simplified. So yeah, from within Europe itself, there's been a number of calls, and the flashpoint for this most recently, people on the webinar may have been following this, was there's been a recent consultation on whether or not to create an environmental omnibus law. And that would essentially roll back several elements of EU environmental laws. And that's been a bit of a flashpoint that's kind of brought up quite a bit of it's, I guess, provided an opportunity for people to raise the issues that they have with the EUDR.
All good points, all good things to examine. And another thing that we want to examine is that in July, members of the European Parliament submitted a motion to quote unquote simplify the benchmarking system for risk classification, which could yet again further delay this already delayed legislation. So what are the changes that the European Parliament requested, and how could this threaten the fight against deforestation, and who would benefit the most from this change?
I'm happy to jump in, unless someone else would like. Sorry, I know I just spoke, but yeah. So the benchmarking is the system that classifies all the countries as low, standard, or high risk, primarily based on their levels of annual deforestation. And in May of this year, it started actually with the EU Council before the EU Parliament. So Agriculture Minister from Luxembourg and Austria raised their objections with the benchmarking. And although all European countries are low risk, what they've argued for is a new zero risk category for countries with no or very little deforestation. So if companies would not need to lodge a due diligence statement for any goods that are coming from a zero risk country, and they wouldn't need to provide geolocation coordinates. So essentially it's a sort of free pass for goods that come from a zero risk country. And then that call got picked up by Parliament in July in this resolution that they put forward, that the EPP, the European People's Party, put forward in July. So that essentially the main beneficiary of this zero risk category proposal would be European based producers. It's less helpful for companies that are importing things from outside Europe, depending where they're importing them from. And I think there's two significant concerns that we have with the zero risk proposal. One is that obviously that just because a country's deforestation levels are low doesn't mean that all the goods from that country are compliant with the EUDR. So having a zero risk exemption, for example, that applied to all of Europe would be turning a blind eye to things like illegal logging in Romania or forest degradation in Sweden, and goods that otherwise might be non-compliant with the EUDR would get a free pass. But the other problem, and this is something that Earthsight's spoken a lot about, is that the zero risk proposal would probably also capture countries with low levels of deforestation outside Europe. And those might include countries like China, for example, that's quite well known for being a country through which illegally logged timber passes. And so you could see a situation where a timber launderer sees the opportunity to send its timber into Europe via China, relabel the timber in China as Chinese to get that free pass of the zero risk proposal, and then send it into Europe without needing to do any due diligence under the EUDR. So we see a lot of risks from the zero risk proposal.
I'll add a third, which is that risk moves. It's you have this leakage where if you have increased pressure to reduce deforestation in one place, it incentivizes clearance in another place. And this can be between ecosystems within a country, like you've seen all the efforts to reduce Amazon deforestation, increase clearance in the Cerrado. It can also take place between countries, between regions. So I think adding this category could really sort of support the development of new deforestation frontiers that might be happening under the radar. So I think, I'm all about simplification. I think, if we can prioritize based on risk, that's great. But I think that having places where there's sort of no compliance or no due diligence actually has the potential to make things worse, because you get sort of an incentive for the opening up of these new frontiers. So I think less about individual winners and losers maybe, but about sort of weakening the theory of change that allows this law to have an impact on deforestation.
I'll agree. And just wanted to say that I'm very skeptical about risk-free. Even if you think about small things like climate change, all of us have an impact just as living, just as eating and doing anything. So I'm really very skeptical about, classifying specific countries risk deforestation free. So I think that implementing this really be a setback. So the policies that are ongoing.
That was an extremely helpful discussion on that question. So thank you all for that. For folks that are still watching, please do drop a question in the chat for our panel. I've got a couple more to address here, and I'll go ahead and do that. But then in a few minutes, I'm going to go ahead and move on to that. So if you have a couple of questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But for now, I want to ask about the so-called trade wars. So, given these current so-called trade wars, how might producer markets struggling to adapt to the EUDR react? What risks are there in redirecting commodities to other lenient markets, which would still allow for deforestation while bringing income to producer countries?
I can start off by sort of saying more of what I said before, which is, a big question with EUDR and how well it's going to work and whether it's going to have the impact we want to have is, you know, what do companies actually need to do across their businesses to reduce deforestation? EUDR applies some leverage to one piece of the system and it gets the attention of sustainability teams and corporate executives, and that's really important. But it's only has the impact that we all want if it's part of this multifaceted effort to transition production landscapes so that new clearance is not incentivized or is not feasible. So, EUDR is one piece of that effort, and it's an important one, and it's putting a lot of spotlight on this, and that's necessary. But in order to sort of complete that theory of change and have the change that we want to see, companies are going to be needing to invest in solutions across their whole supply base, not just the segments going to the EU. So that requires putting money on the table. I think this is where it's like, yeah, the cost of compliance, you can quibble about that and it's important. It's not nothing. But the real thing is, okay, are you putting money on the table that allows producers and producing companies to keep forest standing? Whether that's through price premiums for free goods, whether that's for payments for ecosystem services or for carbon. What is the actual work that's being done to um, incentivize this transition on the ground? So it's not just that, all right, well, now it's easier for this product to go to China, so we're going to send it to China. So I think, and I think that there's that type of approach sort of in compliance, EDR compliance only approach puts companies at further risk also because, those companies need to be ready when, China one day announces that they're only going to accept free products, which, is coming down the road. It's, we don't know exactly when, but I think that is going to happen at some point and companies should be ready for that. So I think, not doing that and only trying to address this piecemeal, both allows that material to go to these more lenient markets, but also puts companies at risk for, the regulatory change down the road.
Thank you, Leah. Fyfe or Karla, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add. I mean, I completely agree, and I think like a key point related to this is the kind of first mover effect that we would hope to see from the EUDR, as Leah has just alluded to, that businesses should be preparing for other countries to put in place similar regulations rather than focusing on how they can be redirecting things to other markets. And I think what we saw with the EUTR, the timber regulation that preceded the EUDR, is a good example of that. We had the Lacey Act in the US, making it illegal to import illegally logged timber, and then that was followed by a number of other regulations. We've got the EUTR, we've got regulations in Australia, we've got Japan, we've got Korea. So I think that's a good example of how that first mover effect can work, and I would hope that we would see that happening with the EUDR as well.
Just 2 points. One is that this selection of markets is already happening. Several experts told me that with the EUDR regulation, the companies are not likely doing the changes in the entire supply chain if they don't export just for the EU. And so they allocate, 6%, 7% of their plants and supply chain, and with that part they're complying with, and the other part they are already sending that production to markets that don't require those requirements. And in the short term, we saw, for example, with the tariffs from the US, Brazil just exported more to China. And actually, last month, Brazil recorded a surplus instead of a loss in exports. So it's a kind of a natural movement we could expect, but I agree with the other panelists that it's not sustainable in the long run because the big, just relying on China, India, and other countries, in the long run, it's not sustainable because they can just say, we don't need you anymore. And then what will they do with all these products on the run?
Thank you so much. So final question. This one's directed at you, Karla. What guidance do you have for other journalists from so-called producer countries covering the EUDR? What are the biggest questions, angles, or stories ahead that you think media should be covering?
Sure. The first tip is like really understand the industry. We cover in the environment. Many times I just focus on the conservation side, but key thing to understand is that the conflict on the environment comes from business. And as I said before, I was a business reporter for 10 years. So as I covered the EUDR, I really brought all that knowledge in place. And like you have to read a lot of documents, understand balance sheet, companies reports, and all that. That can be, challenging and somewhat boring at first glance, and even the legislation. But it's really important to understand both sides, the details, who the key actors are, how the lobby works, understand the interest, because at the end of the day, it's a game, it's a clash of sources, of forces, one from the environment, the other one from the business, as you could see inside the government, the Brazilian government, for example, it is repeats everywhere. So that's to be my main tip. I know that most times journalists don't like much numbers and math and all that, but like really bringing a bit of this financial part to investigate supply chains is key. And also keep an eye out on the reports from several sources, including the two panelists here, because you can really have great tips from reports that are released, or even like from short news. You can even find tips of great stories to pursue that was not covered properly from a note about someone lobbying from the postponement of the regulation, for example.
All right, everyone. That is going to conclude it, and that's pretty much all we have time for today. I just want to say a big thank you to our panelists for such an informative discussion. I learned a lot about the EUDR, and I hope that you all did as well. So if you want to learn more about this topic, you can find our reporting on the EUDR at Mongabay. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a story idea that you want to pitch to us, please go to mongabay.org and find Pitch Mongabay's story on the opportunities page. And as always, if you missed any of this discussion, it's going to be on YouTube in perpetuity after we complete it here, and you'll receive a link to the video along with the conclusion of this webinar if you registered for it. If you want to follow along with our webinar series, I encourage you to subscribe to our webinar newsletter, and you can do that by going to mongabay.com. Find the button that says newsletter in the upper right corner, click on it and subscribe. But of course, you can follow us here on YouTube or on LinkedIn, or on our socials on Threads, Mastodon, Blue Sky, and other platforms where we will announce future webinars. So thank you so much for joining this discussion, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.